Let's just dive right into this, shall we? Today, we're unpacking an explainer on literally one of the most bizarre, laugh-out-loud military operations in recorded history. The year is 1932. And no, this wasn't a clash between two global superpowers. Actually, it was a fully authorized, government-sanctioned military engagement between the Australian Army and a massive flock of flightless birds.
So what actually happens when a modern military decides to declare war on a flock of flightless birds? I mean, it sounds like a pitch for a surreal comedy movie, right? But, as we're going to see, the Great Emu War was a very real, incredibly serious operation for everyone involved. It totally flips our assumptions about technological superiority on its head and shows just how wild nature can be. But to really get how we ended up in this bizarre clash, we have to look at the ground conditions first.
Section 1. The Unlikely Invaders. Drought and Desperation.
Okay, let's set the scene. It's Western Australia, early 1930s. You've got these hardened World War I veterans who traded the trenches for tractors, trying to make a living as farmers. But they're hit with an entirely new kind of crisis, a brutal, unforgiving drought. And this drought was so punishing, it drove a staggering 20,000 emus straight into unprotected farmland. Just picture that for a second. 20,000 giant, hungry birds, essentially marching in mass, desperately hunting for food and water, right onto the exact land these veteran-turned farmers were sweating blood to cultivate.
Now, this wasn't just a flock of pigeons on your lawn. This was an absolute catastrophe for these farmers. The emu threat was, well, it was multifaceted. These massive flocks literally steamrolled the wheat crops flat. They smashed right through fences like they were nothing, and by knocking down those barriers, they left the fields wide open for other pests to just waltz right in. These farmers were staring down total financial ruin, and they were getting truly desperate.
Section 2. Declaring War on Birds. Pest Control.
Faced with total disaster, these World War I veterans turned to a solution they knew all too well: heavy weaponry. They literally asked the government for machine guns, pitching it under the rather creative guise of pest control. And shockingly enough, the Australian government actually agreed. They deployed active-duty soldiers to the farms. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer absurdity of the matchup. On one side, you've got the Australian military, combat-hardened veterans with lethal Lewis machine guns and trucks. On the other side, the emus, big, biological, flightless birds equipped with nothing but tough feathers and the ability to sprint at 30 miles an hour. On paper, pretty much everyone figured this heavily armed human force would just obliterate their feathered foes.
Section 3. Emu Battlefield Tactics. Outmaneuvering the Army.
So the government's task force rolls up. And get this, it's just 2 soldiers, a cameraman, to film their glorious easy victory, and 2 Lewis machine guns. They figured, hey, these targets are huge, they can't fly, this is going to be a cakewalk. Well, reality had other plans. The emus completely won the tactical game. First off, their tactics were wild. Instead of bunching up, the emus split into small, chaotic groups and ran in these crazy, unpredictable zigzag patterns, making it almost impossible for the gunners to track them. Second, the terrain totally favored the birds. Out in the vast open wheat fields, the soldiers had zero cover, but the emus masterfully used the landscape and the broken fences to shield themselves. And lastly, mobility. Emus can hit speeds of 30 miles per hour. Try hitting that while aiming a heavy machine gun from the back of a bouncing off-road truck. Plus, those incredibly dense feathers actually seemed to deflect bullets, and the birds didn't even care about the terrifying noise of the gunfire.
So, put yourself in the very first major engagement of this war. The soldiers spot a flock. They mount up, and they just unleash an absolute torrent of lead. They rip through a staggering 10,000 rounds of military-grade ammunition. 10,000! Let's see how this builds, because out of those 10,000 rounds, guess how many emus they actually managed to take down? A dozen. Exactly 12 emus. The rest of the flock just scattered to the wind, regrouped safely out of range, and brazenly went right back to munching on the farmer's wheat. Now, what's genuinely wild here is the psychological toll this took on the military guys. The soldiers themselves later went on the record and admitted something pretty astounding. The emus seemed to actually learn from being shot at. Think about that. Despite having tiny bird brains, these creatures figured out which tactics got their buddies killed, and they actively adapted to avoid them in the next skirmish. They were literally outsmarting trained combat veterans.
Section 4. A National Embarrassment. Global Laughingstock.
Now, what's really interesting about this whole mess is how fast this local farm issue snowballed into a massive, absolute PR nightmare for the Australian government. The whole thing became a global laughingstock almost overnight. You had actual real-life newspaper headlines screaming things like, "The emus win," and, listen to this brilliant quote, "Machine gunners versus emus, machine gunners retreat." The press just eviscerated the military. They zeroed right in on how ridiculous it was for politicians to authorize active military, complete with thousands of rounds of ammo, to fight birds. I mean, these were guys fresh off the battlefields of World War I, getting outflanked by animals the size of a small person.
The aftermath paints a pretty bleak picture of human overconfidence. Let's break down the stats. This whole operation dragged on for a full month. Out of the 20,000 invading birds, the soldiers managed to kill fewer than 1,000. Some historians even think it was closer to just 200. The grand finale? The military just threw their hands up and quit. They packed up their Lewis guns and drove off, leaving the farmers right back squarely at square one.
Section 5. Lessons learned the hard way. Practical solutions.
So, with the army officially waving the white flag, the farmers had to handle it themselves. But instead of asking for more artillery, they finally pivoted to actual practical solutions. They set up bounty systems for emu eggs to stop the population at the source, and they spent the money on significantly better fencing to just physically block the migration paths. It really forced the Australian government to swallow a pretty humiliating but totally necessary pill. Machine guns are just not a viable solution for wildlife management. You can't shoot biology the way you shoot an enemy army. Meanwhile, the emus kept their title as Australia's top agricultural pest, while also somehow leveling up into undefeated, legendary folk heroes.
So the crucial point we really need to take away from this explainer is that this isn't just some goofy historical footnote. It hits on some pretty deep themes. First, we see the wild, unintended consequences of human encroachment. Remember, it was human farming colliding with a natural drought that displaced the emus in the first place. Second, it really highlights the utter absurdity of throwing military force at civilian and ecological problems, a mistake humans have made time and time again. Third, it is a masterclass in the sheer resilience of nature when faced with human arrogance. I mean, emus are way tougher to put down than anyone thought. And finally, it's about the power of storytelling. What started out as an embarrassing military blunder morphed into a permanent cultural joke and a fantastic lesson in humility.
Which leaves us with one final lingering thought to chew on. What really are the limits of human control over the natural world? We love to build walls, invent high-tech gear, and deploy armies, completely convinced we are the masters of our environment. But as the Great Emu War of 1932 so perfectly reminds us, sometimes nature just zigzags, shakes off our best shots, and leaves us looking pretty silly in our own backyards. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time as we keep unpacking the weird, wonderful stories hiding in our history.